All right, so this is the final information that we're going to be learning on the respiratory system. The respiratory system it's not going to go away. It's going to come up again in the future, particularly when we talk about the immune system. We're going to talk about those surface barriers in the respiratory system and how we actually protect our body from invaders. Today, we are going to kind of wrap up with this kind of larger story of respiration. And this is the actual transport and delivery of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So we have seen this before. We talked about how the respiratory system involves 4 different processes that ultimately transport and deliver and exchange oxygen and CO2. In the beginning of our physiology discussion, we talked about measuring volumes and calculating capacities. We've talked about external respiration and the different physical factors that can affect respiration. And today, we are going to kind of elaborate on external respiration and talk about how both exchange with the tissues and exchange with the outside air is important in the transport of carbon dioxide and oxygen. Okay, and so of course we're going to start by talking about oxygen. Right, in order for pulmonary and tissue gas exchange to occur, O2 and CO2 must undergo chemical reactions in our blood that allow these poorly soluble gases, right? We know that CO2 is about 20 times more soluble than oxygen, but still it's not really that easy to get it into water in the first place. Okay, and after these chemical reactions, these gases need to be transported safely in the blood. Because oxygen is so poorly soluble, only about 1.5% of this gas is actually dissolved in blood plasma. The rest of it has to be transported by the protein that we know about already, and that is hemoglobin. Okay, so there are some features, some characteristics of this hemoglobin molecule we've talked about before. Remember that there are 2 different types of proteins, 2 alphas, 2 betas, and each one of these different protein subunits contains the iron on a heme molecule, and that of course is where oxygen is going to bind. Now each one of these hemes can ultimately bind to 1 oxygen molecule, and so it is possible for 1 hemoglobin molecule to carry up to 4 oxygen molecules. And so when it does carry those 4 oxygen molecules, 1 on each of these hemes, we can say that it is fully saturated. Okay, if only 1 oxygen is bound to 1 hemoglobin or 1 heme group, or 2 or 3, we can call it partially saturated. Okay, so we are going to be talking about something called percent saturation as we go forward in this lesson today. And remember that this is just talking about how there are 4 different places on the hemoglobin molecule for the binding of oxygen. Okay, and so this one here is fully saturated, 100% saturated. This one is 75% saturated. See, it's missing 1 oxygen, and this is 25% saturated here. And so we're going to be looking at these graphs. Y-axis percent saturation of hemoglobin. This is in the blood as a whole, so not really talking about individual molecules, but all of those hemoglobin molecules. And on the x-axis, we have the partial pressure of oxygen. So that's hopefully indicating to you that however much oxygen there is in the blood, that is going to determine how much oxygen is able to load onto hemoglobin or not load onto hemoglobin. And so this hemoglobin saturation depends on 2 different factors. First of all, a term called affinity, right? So how much that oxygen just holds on to that heme for dear life, or I guess vice versa. So affinity means kind of, not to anthropomorphize, but wanting the heme wanting to hold on to oxygen, as opposed to low affinity, which would be the heme kind of spitting off that oxygen. Okay, so the affinity or the bond strength in which hemoglobin Hb binds to oxygen is going to determine how much oxygen is actually on the molecule, right? That makes sense. And the partial pressure of oxygen. Again, the fact that we see this on the x-axis means it's an independent variable. This is going to determine the percent saturation.
Puppy?
All right, so let's dive into this a little bit more. Hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen increases with each additional oxygen molecule. Okay, and so what this is showing us is that if we zoom in on this heme here, and oxygen, or when one oxygen molecule binds to one heme, it physically changes the shape of the hemoglobin molecule. Okay? And in doing so, it actually opens up the rest of these subunits to increase their affinity for oxygen. All right, so I like to think of this as being kind of like a kind of a peer pressure situation, right? As soon as one guy does it, then everybody else is going to want to do it as well. All right, so once one oxygen binds to one heme, then 3 more oxygens are going to load onto those other subunits as quickly as physically possible. Okay, and again, this is all just conformational changes. This is the nature of the hemoglobin molecule. And so this kind of peer pressure situation is more technically called positive cooperativity. To technically define, as oxygen binds, the hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen increases. Right, so this works in reverse as well. Again, peer pressure, as soon as one oxygen dissociates or is spit off the heme portion of the hemoglobin molecule, then the molecule changes shape. And so the rest of these subunits are much more likely to get rid of or dissociate from the oxygen that's bound to those hemes. Okay. All right, the second factor is that when more oxygen is present, right? So when the partial pressure of oxygen is high, hemoglobin will bind more oxygen, right? So the affinity of that hemoglobin for oxygen is going to increase as well. And this is actually one of the main determinants of the percent saturation, right? So if you have more oxygen in your blood in a particular area, such as the lungs, right? This is going to cause more oxygen to bind to hemoglobin more tightly, right? So hemoglobin is going to hold onto that oxygen for dear life as long as there's a lot of oxygen around. When that same blood gets to an area of the body with low oxygen, right? So lower blood oxygen levels, such as in the tissues, right? Particularly really hungry tissues, really active tissues, the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen is going to go way down. Okay, and so this is going to allow one oxygen molecule to unbind to hemoglobin. And of course, as we know, then the other 3 oxygens are going to unbind from hemoglobin. And so this is called an unloading reaction. The idea here is that we want oxygen to bind reversibly to hemoglobin in locations where oxygen levels are high. Right, so in your lungs, we want O2 to be in our blood. We want it to be on hemoglobin. But as that same blood gets to our tissues, where the oxygen is lower, we want that oxygen to be unloaded, given to the tissues. We don't just want it to keep circulating around in our blood, not actually doing anything for us. We need it on our blood in our lungs and out of our blood in our tissues. And so this is a reversible reaction. We're going to be talking about this more and more as we go through this lesson, but essentially in the lungs where there is oxygen, oxygen can bind to HB, hemoglobin, right? So hemoglobin and oxygen here, and it actually spits off a hydrogen ion, okay? In the tissues, oxygen is unloaded from hemoglobin. See, now it is unloaded, and in its place, we're going to see a hydrogen ion bind to that hemoglobin molecule. Okay, so we want it on in the lungs and off in the tissues. Okay, and again, hydrogen is able to bind to hemoglobin whenever it doesn't have an oxygen associated with it. So we're going to talk about that more here in a little bit, but this HHB, hydrogen bound to hemoglobin on its way back to the lungs, is called reduced hemoglobin. Okay. Any questions so far? I know this is kind of heavy stuff. All right. So let's zoom in on the tissues a little bit. We know that oxygen is going to dissociate from hemoglobin, right? It's going to be spit off into the tissues due to low oxygen levels, right, in the tissues. right? Because the tissues are working so hard, they're using so much oxygen. And actually, the more powerful stimulus to spit off carbon dioxide or to spit off oxygen is high carbon dioxide, right? So if this particular tissue here is fed with blood from this capillary here. This tissue is working so very hard. It needs lots of oxygen, so O2 will be low. It is making lots of carbon dioxide via aerobic respiration, and so it needs to get rid of all of that carbon dioxide. And so those two internal conditions are going to facilitate the process of internal respiration. They are going to coax that...
Are you alive, little puppy? Huh?
coax that oxygen to be dissociated, to unbind from hemoglobin. Okay, so this concept is called the Bohr effect, right? So essentially high carbon dioxide is going to facilitate the unloading, the dissociation of oxygen to the most active tissues. And it does this by decreasing the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. Now, there's a lot of different terms here that are floating around. You should just think of affinity as like desire to hold on to oxygen, and low affinity as spitting off the oxygen, right? So the dissociation of that oxygen. Okay. Remember that the most active tissues produce the most CO2. And so we get this natural passive process of most active tissues getting fed the most oxygen. Okay. Again, any questions about that? All right. And so we can graph this, this concept here. Right. This graph that I'm about to draw for you is called the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. And so we saw this a little bit before when we looked at the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. Now let's actually draw in some numbers together. So here on the y-axis, we have percent saturation. So 150, 100% and 50%. Right. On the x-axis, we have the partial pressure of oxygen. This is in millimeters of mercury. Again, not that there's mercury in your lungs or your blood, just this is the pressure. And so we know that the air coming into the lungs has about a 100 millimeter of mercury partial pressure of oxygen. Okay. We'll draw on 50 and one more 26.6. And that number is actually going to be important. Okay. In the lungs, again, we have this partial pressure of oxygen that is approximately 100 millimeters of mercury. And in the lungs, we have a very high affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. That is, hemoglobin is going to bind to every single little oxygen molecule that crosses over that respiratory membrane and goes into the blood. And so we should have about 100% saturation where, in places like the lung, where there is such high oxygen. Okay. Now, of course, as the blood leaves the lungs and it circulates throughout the body, it is going to be delivered to tissues that are working very hard, right? Your heart, your brain, your skeletal muscles, depending on what you're doing. And so in those places, the partial pressure of oxygen is going to decrease, okay? Because, of course, those tissues are using oxygen, as we've discussed. And so we're going to see this very rapid unloading of oxygen from hemoglobin. Okay, so for the most part, actually, that's a little bit not steep enough. Okay, let me try that again. All right, so a rapid unloading of oxygen. And so what this means is that in the tissues, a slight reduction in oxygen is going to lead to a lot of unloading of oxygen from hemoglobin. Okay, in fact, or we can talk about this. Actually, or when we talk about the location of this curve, we can say that the P50, right, or the partial pressure of oxygen at which 50% of hemoglobin is unloaded to the tissues is equal to 26.6, and that is actually the average P50 for a healthy individual at rest. Okay. Right, so this is a curve that you're going to be seeing a lot, and we're going to play with this curve a little bit as we go along. But again, take-home message here for now is that in places of the body where there is a lot of oxygen available, such as in the lungs, there is going to be a very high level of hemoglobin saturation. In places of the body where there is less oxygen, such as in active tissues, we are going to get a lot of unloading very quickly. And remember that this has everything to do with the fact that as soon as one oxygen molecule dissociates from hemoglobin, the entire shape of the molecule changes so that the affinity decreases as you go full, or the affinity for other oxygen molecules decreases, and all of them are going to kind of leave the party. Okay? Again, any questions about that? I just want to add in a couple things here. Over here, there's a high affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen, okay, because the partial pressure of oxygen is high. Over here, we have a lower affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. Okay, and again, I see that these terms are kind of confused by students fairly frequently, so I just want to add as many terms as possible to this graph. All right, so just a little bit more about that oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. The shape of the oxygen hemoglobin curve tells us how the percent saturation and the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood change with respect to one another. So that is what this curve is telling us. We can look, at this curve and essentially figure out how much oxygen is going to be on the hemoglobin versus how much is dissociating from it and being delivered to those tissues. Okay. Again, the shape itself is going to tell us two important factors about hemoglobin. First of all, that the percent saturation of hemoglobin stays pretty constant up at the top there, right? So we have nearly 100% saturation of hemoglobin as long as the oxygen levels in our blood are pretty high. And so what this means is that, even if the oxygen levels in the air, for example, decrease, right? So you go up in altitude and so there's less oxygen around you. Even if the air that's coming into your lungs isn't 100 millimeters of mercury like it would be at sea level, it's okay, right? Because we still have this ability, this affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen that promotes the loading reaction, right? That loads as much oxygen into the blood as physically possible. Okay. Also, if you have some kind of pathology in your lungs, or you are hypoventilating, you're not actually getting enough oxygen into your lungs for whatever reason, it's okay. The oxygen saturation levels in your blood are still going to be just as high, right? So if you put, a little pulse ox on your finger and take a look while breathing, or breathing through a mask, or by our even holding your breath for a while, you'll see that it takes a really long time for your blood oxygen saturation levels to start to go down, right? So this is very beneficial to us. We can exist in a wide variety of conditions, of situations without a problem, right? Furthermore, again, a lot of pathologies prevent a lot of oxygen from getting into your lungs. Remember, we talked about restrictive and obstructive pulmonary disorders. Well, a lot of those individuals never really get much oxygen into their lungs in the first place. And so we actually need this curve to be shaped like this, to be pretty flat in the lungs, so that the affinity is high even when oxygen is relatively low. Okay. The second thing that this curve tells us is that as soon as you pass below a certain level, a certain threshold of blood oxygen levels, we get this very rapid unloading of oxygen. Okay, so when the partial pressure of oxygen drops to about 40 millimeters of mercury, the percent saturation drops rapidly. And so this is really important because this is often the oxygen levels that are present in your capillaries. Right? And so this leads to a very rapid unloading. Of course, the blood is flowing through those capillaries really quickly, and we need to facilitate this process as quickly as possible to feed our tissues as quickly as possible. Okay. And so also this allows hemoglobin to unload oxygen where it is needed only. So not in tissues that aren't really working very hard. Only the hungriest of the tissues actually get the oxygen unloaded from the hemoglobin. If the tissue is not very active, the hemoglobin holds onto that oxygen and it just makes another cycle around the body. Okay. We can change this graph, right? We can change this relationship and therefore change the effect of affinity on hemoglobin saturation. There are a few different factors that we'll talk about. And essentially, as you're thinking about this, you should just be thinking of, what would be happening in the body when the body is most active, right? So when you get up off the couch from watching this lesson and go outside and you run a 5K, what is going to be different about your body? Okay, and so essentially, when you run a 5K, you want the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen to be very low, right? You want that oxygen to actually be delivered to your tissue, not just like, make many rounds around your body without actually going to your tissues. So you want low affinity, and you're going to get that low affinity by increasing your body temperature. Okay. Right, you're sweaty, you're working really hard, and so your body temperature is going to go up. You are going to be making a lot more metabolic byproducts, right? A lot more CO2, a lot more hydrogen, right? As we'll see, so lactic acid, as it's building up in your muscles, that is decreasing your body's pH. And also, there are a lot of other metabolic byproducts, such as this here, BPG, or DPG. This is just, a metabolic byproduct of working really hard. Okay, and so let us draw in again these graph or on this graph. Okay, so what we looked at before was a oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve that looked roughly like this. All right, so that is normal. Okay, now what happens when we start to exercise? When we exercise, the curve is going to shift to the right. Okay, so this entire curve is supposed to be the same general shape, but the entire curve shifts to the right. And so what we have done here is we have changed the P50. Okay, so normally it is 26.6, for example. All right, so when the partial pressure of oxygen is about 26.6, 50% of the hemoglobin has unloaded its oxygen. Now, under these exercise conditions, we have shifted the entire curve over. So now the P50 maybe is 50. Okay, so what this means is that a smaller decrease in oxygen is going to facilitate more oxygen being delivered to the tissues. Okay, and so exactly what can produce these changes? An increase in all of these things. Okay, so carbon dioxide, right? When CO2 goes up, that essentially means that our body is needing more oxygen, so we want to unload more of it to our tissues. If the acidity goes up, right? So this actually means that pH is going to decrease. Okay. When we have more of this 2,3 DPG or BPG, right? These are just metabolic byproducts that we can measure. These indicate or these influence our hemoglobin to change shape in such a way that they're going to spit off oxygen more easily. Anytime we exercise in general, so like proprioceptors and whatnot are going to indicate that our body is moving and therefore we should deliver more oxygen. And finally, temperature, both when we're exercising as well as when you have a fever, for example, right, your whole body temperature is going to go up, and this actually facilitates the unloading of oxygen at your tissues. Okay, so again, when any of these increase, this is going to shift the curve to the right, right? And so effectively, that is going to decrease the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. Okay. Translation, more oxygen is delivered to the tissues. Right? Because we need more oxygen, because we're sick, we're fighting something, we have a fever, because we are exercising and we need lots of oxygen to supply our muscles. Okay, and so I list these things out in this way because there's a little device that we can use to memorize this. Right, and that is cadet face right. Okay, so we have C A D E T. So cadet face right. Anytime there's an increase in any of these things, the entire curve is going to shift to the right, which is going to lead to a decreased affinity, which is going to lead to more oxygen delivery to your tissues. Okay, so again, I know there's a lot of crazy terms here. It's a pretty big concept. Any questions before we move along? All right, I'm sure you'll go back and watch again. Okay, so that is the transport of oxygen. As we can see, CO2 is really important in the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. And so let's talk a little bit more about carbon dioxide. It really is what the body cares a little bit more about because oxygen and hemoglobin relationships aren't really changed that much as long as you have a reasonable amount of oxygen around, right? There's a lot of variability in oxygen levels before we actually start seeing a decrease in hemoglobin saturation. Okay. Carbon dioxide is going to change this affinity quite a lot, and it's actually really important in not just feeding your tissues, but also a lot of other processes as well. Okay, so carbon dioxide, as we know, is more soluble than water is. Therefore, it has a lot more options for transport than oxygen does. Okay. Let's see, a small amount of carbon dioxide can diffuse out of the tissues into the capillaries and just kind of circulate around all by itself, right? So a little bit is dissolved in the plasma, like 7 to 10%, really not that much more than oxygen, but still not terribly much. Some carbon dioxide actually can bind to hemoglobin. Okay, so you can't have carbon dioxide and oxygen bound to hemoglobin at the same time. CO2 actually binds to another portion of hemoglobin than the heme. But essentially, as long as carbon dioxide is bound to the protein component of hemoglobin, you can't have oxygen bind to that hemoglobin molecule. And so about 20% of CO2 is transported from the tissues back up to the lungs, attached to hemoglobin, and we can call this molecule carbaminohemoglobin. All right, so here's the hemoglobin, carbon dioxide, and it is actually bound to the amino acid portion, not the heme, but the protein portion of hemoglobin. Okay, so that's about 20%, but the overwhelming majority of carbon dioxide is transported in your blood as bicarbonate. Now, you might remember bicarbonate because this is the main buffer system that is in your blood. We, of course, need to maintain a pH of around 7.4, and we do that with this reversible reaction between bicarbonate and carbonic acid. Okay, and so that is what we're going to be focusing on now. We can see that carbon dioxide diffuses into the blood, it enters into our erythrocytes, and there's going to be a reaction with water once it gets in our erythrocytes that ultimately leads to the production of bicarbonate and these hydrogen ions. Okay, so this is a reversible reaction. This here is carbonic acid, and this is bicarbonate. Okay, so we're going to be talking about what all of this stuff is happening in here in just a moment. Before we move on, I do want to point out that the Bohr effect essentially describes how carbon dioxide can lead to a decreased affinity of oxygen or of hemoglobin for oxygen. The Haldane effect is going to determine how much CO2 is transported, or how much CO2 transport is affected by oxygen content. Okay, so we're going to focus less on that. The Bohr effect is really important and is essentially demonstrated by the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. Okay, so note the Haldane effect is not in blue. It's not something you have to recite back for me. The Bohr effect is more important for our class. Okay, so oxygen and, or taking a step back, this image here, we're going to come back to a couple times. This is just showing us the normal circulatory route of the blood. Here is the pulmonary circulation. Remember, deoxygenated blood, therefore carrying lots of carbon dioxide, hydrogen bound to hemoglobin, enters into the lungs. I keep telling you that some kind of magic is happening in the lungs to reoxygenate the blood before being pumped back out to the tissues. Right, so this is internal respiration, this is external respiration. Okay, let us focus now on internal respiration, okay, where oxygen enters into capillary beds with or bound to hemoglobin. When it enters these tissues, the tissues themselves have very low oxygen levels and they have very high carbon dioxide. And so, as we know now, these conditions are going to decrease the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. Therefore, the oxygen is released from the hemoglobin molecules and it is able to diffuse into the tissues. In these active tissues, we have the production of a lot of things like lactic acid, right? So the stuff that gives you the cramp in your side when you're working out really hard. And so this increase in acidity, right, more hydrogen ions, is going to also facilitate this unloading. Right, those leftover hydrogen ions that are produced by your superactive tissues are going to bind to hemoglobin. Remember, HHB is reduced hemoglobin, and that is going to circulate back up and ultimately into the lungs. Okay, this mere taking up this binding of these excess hydrogen ions is automatically going to increase the pH in this area. Okay. Also, the increased CO2 also leads to more oxygen delivery to the tissues. If you remember back to the cardiovascular system discussions, metabolically active tissues, right, the ones that are producing the most CO2, are going to vasodilate. They are going to relax those precapillary sphincters so that ultimately more blood is flowing to active tissues. And of course, more oxygen is going to be unloaded at these metabolically active tissues. In general, no matter how active the tissue is, only a fifth to a quarter of that oxygen is actually dumped off in the tissues in one particular cycle around the body. Okay, so we never completely unload oxygen. We can increase or decrease it, but still like 80% is going to return to the heart. So when we say deoxygenated blood, I'm never saying that there is no more oxygen on the blood. Instead, it's just less than it used to be. So in theory, these veins would actually be purple. Right? On one of our models, the veins are purple instead of blue, and that's why there's always some oxygen left on the blood. Okay, so let's put these pieces together. On your slides, I've given you both of these images. Let us first focus on what's happening in the lungs. Okay, so what is happening way up here? We know that in the tissues, we have produced a lot of carbon dioxide, right? We need to get rid of that carbon dioxide. Actually, I changed my mind here. Let's talk about the tissues first. Sorry about that. In the tissues, right? So way down here in the systemic circulation, we know that our tissue cells are producing a ton of carbon dioxide. We know that carbon dioxide is going to facilitate the unloading of hemoglobin. So how exactly does that work, and how is carbon dioxide transport affecting that process? Okay. CO2 diffuses across the tissue cell membranes into the capillary and into our erythrocytes. Once in our erythrocytes, carbon dioxide is going to be bound to water by an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. Okay, this enzyme ultimately produces this molecule right here, which I'll add in a word for you here. This is called carbonic acid. Okay, so again, carbon dioxide from your tissues is going to enter into your red blood cells. An enzyme that is in your red blood cells, carbonic anhydrase, is going to join carbon dioxide and water to produce carbonic acid. Now, carbonic acid is going to immediately dissociate into bicarbonate, right, HCO3, and hydrogen ions, right? So this is acid right here, right? So this is decreasing the pH. And so this hydrogen can actually spit, or it can bind to the hemoglobin that is already in your red blood cells. Remember that hemoglobin has been bound to oxygen. Okay, so as soon as hydrogen ions are spit off of bicarbonate, again, because of the addition of carbon dioxide, oxygen will be released, right, and therefore it is able to go out to the tissues. Hydrogen binds to hemoglobin and produces this reduced hemoglobin molecule. Okay, so this is physically how how carbon dioxide and acid can promote the unloading of oxygen from hemoglobin. Right, CO2 comes in, leading to the production of bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. Hydrogen binds to hemoglobin, therefore kicking oxygen off, and now these hydrogen ions are transported to the lungs where they can be dealt with accordingly. Okay, now back to this bicarbonate molecule, right? We know that carbonic acid and bicarbonate are the primary buffer system of the blood. Right? We don't want a ton of these bicarbonate ions just hanging out in our red blood cells. We want that buffering capacity to be utilized within our plasma. So bicarbonate is actually going to be transported out of our red blood cells to circulate within our plasma where we can actually use it. The thing is, bicarbonate is a negative ion. It is an anion. And so when bicarbonate leaves the erythrocytes, it's going to change the charge of our red blood cells. And so that's not ideal. And so what we do is we exchange this anion, this negatively charged molecule, with another negatively charged substance. And so we see here that chloride, an anion, is going to be exchanged for bicarbonate. And again, the whole purpose of this is just to keep the charge of the cell neutral. Okay, so this process here is called the chloride shift. Okay, whole purpose is to keep the cell the same charge. Okay, so again, all of this is happening within the systemic circulation. Right, so within the tissues that are really active, CO2 is produced by the cells, enters into our red blood cells. Carbonic anhydrase is going to form carbonic acid by joining together carbon dioxide and water. Carbonic acid immediately dissociates into hydrogen and bicarbonate. Hydrogen is going to kick oxygen off of hemoglobin. Oxygen can now diffuse into our tissues, and hydrogen can be transported back to the lungs where we can deal with it again. Okay, and the bicarbonate is going to be kicked out of the cell in exchange for a chloride ion to make sure that that charge of the cell remains the same. Okay, any questions about that at this point? Okay. Again, I know that's a little heavy. In the lungs, right, we are pretty much going to complete this process, but in reverse, right? So internal respiration has just gathered up carbon dioxide from the tissues, unloaded oxygen, and now we want to reverse that process up here in the lungs. All right, so the very first thing we need to do in the lungs is to get bicarbonate back into our red blood cells. So we do a reverse of the chloride shift. Bicarbonate comes into our red blood cells and chloride exits. Again, chloride shift, but in reverse. Okay, bicarbonate is going to join together with hydrogen ions. Now, where do those hydrogen ions come from? Well, remember they were transported in the red blood cells on the hemoglobin. Okay, so now hydrogen is going to dissociate from hemoglobin, freeing up hemoglobin to take in and bind to oxygen from the lungs. Right, so oxygen is now going to bind to hemoglobin, right, which is really ultimately what we want here. And this hydrogen, right, doesn't go away. What do we do with it? Well, hydrogen is now going to bind again to bicarbonate. Remember that HCO3 minus is bicarbonate. Okay, so hydrogen binds to bicarbonate, forming carbonic acid. Okay, carbonic acid is then broken down by the same enzyme that made it in the first place, carbonic anhydrase, and it's broken down into water and carbon dioxide. And so now carbon dioxide has been liberated from its transport molecule, the bicarbonate, and now it can be exhaled from the lungs. All right, so a lot more is going on here than we initially discussed. I show you this, so that you can learn this process and see how bicarbonate and carbonic acid relate to one another. This is a reversible reaction. If we have more carbon dioxide in the tissues, we make more bicarbonate. That increases our buffering capacity of our blood. Also, we get this interaction here between acid, hydrogen ions, hemoglobin, and oxygen. Right? So all of these processes are connected together. This is why increased acid is going to lead to more unloading of oxygen at the tissues. This is why increased carbon dioxide is going to lead to more unloading of oxygen at the tissues. Right? So this essentially shows us how the Bohr effect is actually working. Again, any questions about that? Just another way of showing you all of these interactions. Right here are the alveoli. Oxygen enters into the red blood cells. Hydrogen ions leave, right? And the oxygen binds to hemoglobin. Hydrogen ions can then bind to bicarbonate, which was out here in the plasma. Now it is in the red blood cells due to a chloride shift. Bicarbonate and hydrogen forms carbonic acid. Carbonic acid broken down by carbonic anhydrase into CO2 water. CO2 can then be exhaled in the lungs. Right, so all of this stuff is happening lightning fast. Again, any questions there? All right. And so here we see the same reaction, CO2, carbonic acid, bicarbonate, and hydrogen ions. Okay, and so all along I've been telling you that the respiratory system can affect the body's pH or the blood pH. And we haven't really explored very much how that is possible. And so now we have enough information to have that conversation. Right? Essentially, the relationship is that the more CO2 you have in your body, right, so the more active your tissues are, this is going to increase your carbonic acid and therefore hydrogen ion concentration in your blood, which is going to decrease your pH. And so our respiratory system can change our body's pH by essentially exhaling more or less carbon dioxide out of our lungs. Right? So if we have more CO2, if we are building up more CO2, this decreases our pH. If we want to bring that pH back up to normal, we just need to get rid of more carbon dioxide. How do we get rid of more carbon dioxide? Well, we exhale more carbon dioxide. Okay. Also, our respiratory system is, or together with the cardiovascular system, is responsible for producing bicarbonate. Right? Bicarbonate is the primary buffer system in our blood. And so we can produce more or less bicarbonate essentially by holding on to more CO2 or releasing more CO2 out of the lungs. All right, remember that this buffer system, this bicarbonate, is a buffer, and as such, if the hydrogen concentration in the blood rises, right, so if the pH of the body goes down, bicarbonate is able to bind to this excess hydrogen and therefore essentially removing it from the plasma and bringing that pH back up. If the hydrogen concentration in the blood decreases, okay, so it's going to drop, therefore the pH is going to go up, it's going to be too high. In order to bring that back down, we need to somehow mobilize hydrogen ions. We need more hydrogen in the plasma. As a result, carbonic acid, right, so carbonic acid versus bicarbonate here, is going to dissociate from hydrogen ions. It's essentially going to spit those hydrogen ions out, and therefore they're going to be circulating within the plasma once again. Okay, and so this is essentially how our respiratory system can change the pH, right, by changing how much bicarbonate there is due to how much CO2 we keep in our body or exhale. Ultimately, the only way of getting rid of hydrogen ions, right, so actually getting them out of your body and more permanently shifting your pH, is to utilize the kidneys. Okay, so that's in our next unit, talking about how the kidneys can affect this buffering capacity and can ultimately affect how many hydrogen ions are in our body. Okay, so at the end of our last lesson together, I started talking about levels of CO2 and oxygen, and essentially how we can like breathe into the paper bag if we're hyperventilating, and that is going to shift our pH. Right, so let's talk about this just a little bit more. Hyperventilating, right? So breathing too much is essentially exhaling too much carbon dioxide. Remember that even fairly large shifts in oxygen aren't actually going to affect the oxygen content of your blood. What the body cares about a lot more is carbon dioxide, right? Because carbon dioxide shifts very dramatically based on what's going on with your body. And so when you hyperventilate, you are exhaling too much carbon dioxide. The CO2 levels in your blood are going to go down, and therefore your pH is going to go up. Right, so this might be a flashcard kind of a thing. It's a lot of this goes up, that goes down. Really important to get these concepts straight. Again, when you breathe out too much carbon dioxide, you are increasing your pH, and we can call this condition respiratory alkalosis, right? So this is a condition where your blood pH is too high because of some kind of a problem with your respiratory system. This particular problem is breathing too much. Okay, so obviously that one is much less common, at least pathologically, than hypoventilation. So if you're not breathing enough, right? So this could be either you are holding your breath, right? You have a restrictive or an obstructive pulmonary disorder. So even though you're trying so hard to breathe, you're not actually getting enough new air into your lungs. And so what this is going to do is not allow enough exhalation of carbon dioxide. As CO2 builds up in your blood, the pH is going to go down, right? So pretty much if you need one little nugget to hold on to, high CO2 equals acidity, right? So acid equals CO2, right? And acidity, of course, is low pH. And so this condition, right, regardless of the reason for the hypoventilation, is called respiratory acidosis, right? You are more acidic because more CO2 is in your blood. Therefore, the acidosis that has been produced is a problem with your respiratory system. Okay. There are a couple other kind of categories of these alkalosis versus acidosis conditions. Collectively, they are called metabolic alkalosis and acidosis. So essentially, any other abnormality within your body that is going to change the pH is essentially called metabolic. Okay, and so this is actually compensated for by the respiratory system. Right, so for example, if you are vomiting excessively, right, so you got food poisoning, you just keep on vomiting, you are essentially reducing the hydrogen ion concentration in your blood because you are losing so much stomach acid. This is going to bring the entire pH of your body up. So that would be called metabolic acidosis. And so your respiratory system can actually change how quickly you're breathing so that your pH can come back down. Right? So for example, if the problem is we don't have enough hydrogen ions, right, we want to essentially keep more carbon dioxide in our body to make sure that that pH goes back down. And so you would actually breathe less after food poisoning so that you hold on to more CO2 and hold on to more acidity. Okay. Again, we're going to come back around to this concept again when we get into the renal system, right, the urinary system, because pH balance is connected between respiratory, urinary, and cardiovascular, right? So hold those thoughts. Okay. The fact that the respiratory system can compensate for these issues originating somewhere else in the body means that there has to be some kind of detection mechanism, right? We have to know that the blood's pH is too high, the blood's pH is too low. And so we actually utilize structures that we've talked about before in the cardiovascular system. We utilize chemoreceptors. Okay, and so these chemoreceptors are the same ones that we used to modify the heart rate, to modify the blood pressure. Chemoreceptors in the carotids, chemoreceptors in the aortic arch, right? And they're going to be communicating with the same region of the brain, right? So so they're going to be communicating with the brainstem. Essentially, they're detecting high carbon dioxide, and as we know, that's the big one, low pH, and to a lesser extent, low oxygen levels. So essentially, if any of these conditions are met, what that means is that ventilation must be insufficient now, right? CO2 is building up in our blood. Therefore, we need to get rid of it. We need to breathe faster. The pH is going down, right? So that must mean that we're not exhaling enough CO2, and so our pH is reducing. Okay. On the other hand, if CO2 has decreased or pH has increased, ventilation must be too much right now. We must be breathing too fast. So it's time to slow that breathing back down. Okay. And so unlike the cardiovascular system, there are several different regions within the brainstem that are responsible for regulating this ventilation. Okay. The medulla oblongata, of course, receives messages from these chemoreceptors. Okay. And the medulla generally controls ventilation. right? So how much you're breathing in and out. But then we also have a few regions within the pons, right? Another area of the brainstem that are responsible for influencing the rhythm of our respiration. Now, for the most part, breathing is subconscious, right? So unless you're thinking about it, or when you're not thinking about it, you are breathing, right? Your breathing will increase, it will decrease, it will essentially match the needs of your body without thought. Now, the respiratory system is a little bit different than the other systems in that we can consciously control, like override what our autonomic nervous system is doing, but for the most part, this is a completely automatic process. Okay. So when the brainstem receives this information from the chemoreceptors and some other receptors, which I'll talk about here in just a moment, the pons medulla can modify the respiratory system in order to meet the needs of the body at the time, right? Do we have too much CO2? Do we have too little CO2? How do we get back to normal, right? And so in response to messages from all of these different neurons, right? And again, we'll get into the rest here in just a moment. The autonomic nervous system is going to, or autonomic nervous system as well as somatic nervous system are going to stimulate contractions in the respiratory system muscles, right? So I mentioned the somatic nervous system because the diaphragm can be controlled completely consciously, right? The intercostal muscles can be controlled completely consciously, right? You can decide, I'm going to hold my breath. I am going to breathe slower to calm myself down because this is, so much information. I'm kind of freaking out right now. So you take a deep breath and you go slower. And so you are consciously controlling those actions. And so this information is bolded because it's really important. These are the triggers to increase ventilation, right? So essentially the opposite of this would be triggers for your pons medulla to suppress your ventilation rate. Okay, so again, carbon dioxide is the big one, right? Too much CO2 means that we need to breathe faster, right? So always just think about what would be happening in my body if I was to get up and go run a 5K, right now. And of course, your skeletal muscles would produce more CO2. And so that means you need to increase your ventilation. You need to breathe faster. I had to get rid of that extra CO2. Okay. So again, the chemoreceptors are really important in informing the brainstem what is going on with the body so that the brainstem can alter ventilation rate accordingly. Rising carbon dioxide levels are the most powerful respiratory stimulant. Okay? Oxygen doesn't change that much. CO2 does. And so that is what our body cares most about. Okay. In general, blood oxygen levels can affect your breathing rate, but not until they are dangerously low. Okay, so if your body is going off of oxygen levels, it means that you're in bad shape. Right? There's not very much oxygen in your blood anymore. Something like 40 millimeters of mercury in your blood is when oxygen levels are ultimately going to determine your ventilation rate. Okay? In general, blood oxygen levels can influence how sensitive those chemoreceptors are. Right. So for example, if you move to high altitude, your chemoreceptor sensitivity might change just a little bit because overall, you're never really getting more than 80 in your blood at any point. Okay, so when a substantial drop in oxygen occurs, so less than 60 millimeters of mercury, this causes the respiratory centers to directly increase ventilation. Okay. So those are chemoreceptors, of course, very important, but we also have a lot of other information coming in from elsewhere in your body to inform your brainstem of how quickly you need to be breathing. Okay. Next, we have stretch receptors. Right. So there are stretch receptors within the walls of your thorax. Okay. And so essentially, whenever you increase the volume of your thoracic cavity, those muscles stretch out, of course, and that's going to tell your brainstem that you have just taken in a huge breath. and now you should suppress that breathing, right? So huge breath means that you have breathed enough, and so this essentially triggers your parasympathetic nervous system to inhibit any future inhalation. And so this is actually called the Herringbrewer Reflex. Its function, of course, is to prevent overextension of your thorax, right? You don't want to actually like pull a muscle breathing. And so any excessive stretch of your thorax is going to immediately trigger your parasympathetic nervous system, right? So slow down your breathing. We don't want to hurt ourselves just by taking a breath in. So this is actually what you are triggering when your mom tells you to just take a deep breath, right? It's not an old wives' tale. This is actual physiology. I tell you to take a deep breath because when you do so, you are automatically switching your active autonomic division from sympathetic, oh my gosh, I'm freaking out, this is so much information, to rest and digest, to okay, like it's all going to be okay. I am rested. I am able to take in new information again and think clearly, not continually exhibit this fight or flight response where you're panicking and you can't really take information in as easily. Proprioceptors, right? So as soon as you move your body, right, your proprioceptors inform your brainstem that we are moving. We're probably going to need more oxygen to our tissues really soon. You should probably increase your breathing. And finally, as I briefly mentioned, we also have cortical control. So we have voluntary control over these muscles. Unlike any other system in our body, right? Not cardiovascular, not digestive, not urinary, none of these things can be controlled voluntarily. They are just completely automatic. The respiratory system is the one visceral organ system that actually allows us to say, nope, we don't want the sympathetic, we want the parasympathetic nervous system to engage right now. And so our hypothalamus and our limbic system can often override our respiratory system, right? So, anything like kind of emotional, right? Like you see something startling, right? You watch a scary movie and I wasn't expecting that, right? There's no reason, there's no physiological reason why your breathing should be changed in response to, somebody jumping out of the shadows. But our limbic system overrides whatever our autonomic nervous system is doing in our respiratory system to change our breathing patterns. Right? And of course, our cerebrum, we can make these conscious decisions to breathe really fast or breathe really slow. And our cerebrum can say, nope, I am going to take control over breathing now, right? Unless fatal, right? So if you are hyperventilating to an extent that it's becoming dangerous to you, you are going to pass out, right? And that essentially turns your cerebrum off to an extent. So that your autonomic nervous system can go back to meeting the needs of the body and you're okay again. Okay, any questions at this point? We're almost through today. All right, so this diagram here is showing us all of the different sensory information coming into the brainstem, right, to ultimately control ventilation rate, and all of the control mechanisms from higher centers of the brain, which can override them. Okay, so remember the chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors are going to detect CO2 mostly, but also acid, also oxygen levels in the blood. Like how are we doing? How do we need to change our breathing to regulate these? Intercostal muscles contain stretch receptors, and so every time our rib cage stretches out, that automatically stimulates an exhale, a decrease in ventilation. right? Our proprioceptors within our muscles, right? If we're moving our muscles, we're moving our body, we therefore need to breathe faster to feed those muscles. Okay. Really, the only inhibitory stimulus, right? The only inhibition of our respiratory system is this Herringbrewer reflex. Okay, so note that all of the rest of these can be positive. The only consistently negative information being sent to the brainstem is your Herringbrewer reflex, right? So that is how you calm down, you stimulate your parasympathetic division so that you rest and you relax. It's okay. And of course, you don't stretch out your lungs too much. Our respiratory system, of course, takes all of these different factors into account in order to meet the needs of the body. A normal response to exercise is to increase your breathing rate. Okay, so hyperpnea is an increase in ventilation rate 10 to 20-fold higher than what it would be at rest. This is not considered hyperventilation because this is a response to all of these high CO2, low oxygen, low pH. And so your body is responding to those high levels and it is keeping them relatively consistent by changing your breathing. Okay, these adjustments are actually triggered just by psychological stimuli, right? So if you ever notice, like, you're thinking, I'm going to get up and run a 5K, and just thinking about the exercise automatically increases your ventilation rate without even thinking about it. And so this entire process is stimulated first by thinking about moving, and then, of course, by more acidity, more carbon dioxide, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this process is going to maintain appropriate levels of pH, carbon dioxide, and oxygen in a completely natural way. Coming back to high altitude, I talk about this a lot because your body acclimates to high altitude pretty quickly, right? We talked about how more EPO is released into the blood and therefore you make more red blood cells at high altitude. So of course you can take up any oxygen you possibly can, even in this low oxygen environment. Your breathing, of course, is also changed quite considerably at high altitude. In the beginning, if you've ever tried to exert yourself after going to the mountains, within the first couple days, you'll know that it is a really, really crummy feeling. Your head feels like it's going to explode. You feel like you're going to pass out all the time. You might even feel a little bit nauseous. And so that is merely a reflection of the fact that your body has not modified itself in such a way that you're going to be able to have enough oxygen at your tissues just yet. And so what this low oxygen environment does is it changes your chemoreceptors to become more responsive to carbon dioxide. Okay, so an even smaller shift in CO2 is going to lead to more rapid breathing. Okay, and it does so because there is less oxygen in the air. Okay, and so if you compare the minute ventilation rates of someone at Stockton versus someone in Denver, you'll see that people in Denver are actually going to be breathing more, right? So they are going to be exchanging more air with the outside world in hopes of getting enough oxygen ultimately. Okay, and of course, we know that EPO is going to make more red blood cells, so this entire process becomes much more efficient. All right. So